Hello and welcome to the Digitally Overwhelmed podcast. My name is Cynthia Pacheco and I'm on a mission to help online businesses step out of digital overwhelm and step into their creative potential. This podcast is all about helping women get more in tune with the analytics and SEO side of their business without the digital burnout. Get more information about the podcast at digitalbloomiq.com. Why, hello there. Welcome to another episode of the Digitally Overwhelmed podcast. I'm Cynthia, your host, and I run Digital Bloom IQ, where I help health and wellness businesses get found in Google and heal more of the world. And today I'm going to be talking all about what's the difference between a web developer, a web designer, and an SEO expert. And this is something that was inspired from a conversation I was having with a client. And they were just really confused about who they should be hiring when it came to some changes they wanted to make on their website. And this is actually a very common question. So I'm really excited to talk through this today. And I realized it was one of those things that I just assumed everybody would know about. But there are actually some important distinctions between each of these roles. And just off the bat, I want to mention that instead of thinking of them as different people, think of them as separate skills. And so that can make it a little bit easier to identify who you should be hiring. And sometimes there are very clear delineated people who only have web developer skills. That was my cat sneezing. And then there are people who, have they're a hybrid, right? So they're kind of like unicorns. So we're going to be getting into that, and we're going to be getting into like the different scenarios and my recommendations for each of those. So as always, I have full show notes on this episode and other episodes on my website. All you need to do is go to digitalbloomiq.com/SEO/roles. And there you'll get all the text version. I usually always include a little bit of extra information on the show notes because I really like people to get a lot of value from them. And since I am an SEO expert, I just go a little bit, I like to give you guys like really nice blog posts and information on my website that you wouldn't get anywhere else. And I really recommend checking those out because it can give you that extra oomph if you need it to make decisions around this question. Okay, so let's jump in. So what is the real difference? So all roles have really important skills. And I think the key here to remember is that there can be some crossover between these skills. So for example, in my case, I am an SEO expert, but I have a background in coding and I have a background as a web developer. However, I do not consider myself a web developer because I wouldn't, let's say, I guess I could build a website from scratch if I really wanted to. But I wouldn't take on that type of project at this point. It's just like this whole other set of skills that I'm not really practicing these days. Same thing with web design. I really enjoy well-designed things, and I think I have sort of eye. But when it comes to my own business, I hired a branding expert and a web designer, and I actually got my site designed by someone. So this is all to say that it's helpful to, again, think of these as separate skills and that it's totally normal for there to be a crossover. So when you're thinking of hiring someone, making sure you're asking them the right questions and asking them, do they have web developer skills? Do they have web design skills, depending on what you're doing? And with SEO as well, there might be web developers who do say they have SEO skills. And so you just need to be really, really curious and ask them, what type of SEO do you do? Just because there are so many different types of SEO services out there. And so, and this isn't to say, people are trying to trick you or anything. It's just good to get a clear sense of what you're getting when you're hiring someone. And I actually have a whole episode on that, episode 141, called Types of SEO Services. I run through the different types of SEO services that you might get, depending on who you're hiring And I go into like this difference of like what a web developer might be hiring, what they might be giving you versus an SEO expert. So the other thing I want to mention is that all these roles can be super technical. So when I say technical, I mean, the code aspect or just the technicality. All jobs have like a technical aspect, and where people are getting into lingo. I'm sure we've all had that experience when you go to the doctor and they're telling you about, something you guys are working through, and they're using that technical medical jargon. And so it's hard to understand what they're talking about. And so then, you ask them, and they kind of, most people like come down and they tell it to you in plain human language. So all jobs have this kind of like technical lingo thing, and that is fine. And of course we want our web developers to know code, and we want, the web designers to know their color theory and all that. But what you really want to make sure that the person you're hiring knows is that some strategy and some overall business savviness. So people you are hiring, especially when it comes to your website, unless you have a very specific job that you just want done, like a technical job, you want someone to fix an error for you and that's it. But I would argue even those little jobs, it's so great when you have someone who understands your business, understands how you make money, and is always looking out for you when it comes to how to make your website really, really an ongoing employee for you and making more money or reaching whatever your goals are, right? So yeah, all these different roles, including the SEO expert, could get really technical. You could have an SEO expert who says, you need to do this on your website, you need to do that, you need to create this blog post. But there's never a thought process of like, well, how is this helping me reach my goals? So please ask them those questions. And if they're not asking you questions about your business, you definitely need to pay attention to that, because at the end of the day, if SEO isn't really helping you towards your bottom line, and I think this kind of goes for all the roles, but it's really important for SEO. If it's not really working towards where you're going, then it's going to be really demotivating, right? And you're going to give up, and you're going to kind of question it. You're going to say, well, why did I invest my time in this? There needs to be this connection with the rest of your marketing plan and the rest of your marketing in general, because otherwise it doesn't work well in isolation anyway. So, and like I said, with a web designer too, you'll have web designers who are really thoughtful, and they understand your audience. And so they're creating a design, and they're picking colors that they know will help you make more money down the line. So it's not always so easy to quantify, but I think it is important to hire someone who just understands your business, understands your audience, and it's not like a completely isolated thing. Okay, so let's start with the web developer. So a web developer is someone, strictly speaking, is building code and making changes for your website. So the biggest distinction I would say at this, just to start off the bat, is they have some hardcore or pretty hardcore coding skills. So they would know HTML, CSS, JavaScript, depending on what your website is built on. If you have a WordPress site, there's different ranges of coding skills needed. And WordPress is actually pretty friendly from a web developer point of view. I've actually met some people who have hard coded their sites, although I don't understand the benefit of that unless you're like a big company and you want that sort of control. But if we're talking a small to medium business, even larger businesses, having something like Squarespace or WordPress, WordPress is the one that a lot of people lean towards just because it has so much flexibility. Of course, with that flexibility comes responsibility. And that's why we have a web developer, right? They're kind of like the code keepers of our website. They keep our website secure and safe. And I think it's super important to have either ongoing a web developer, either you pay someone monthly to keep track of all the updates and all that. Sorry, so this is for WordPress. When you have a Squarespace site, that's the price that you pay in terms of security and all that. But with WordPress, you really need someone on top of that stuff. And I forgot to mention, I'm going to be adding in the show notes some recommended people that I work with. And these are all web developers, web designers who I've collaborated with on different projects, and they just are great. So if you do need recommendations, I will be including them in the show notes. But yes, so a web developer basically is here to help us maintain our sites, to build a website from scratch, or to potentially fix an existing website. So they are, like I said, kind of the coding people. They have in sometimes some web designing skills, and I'm going to get into what that means. But they are the back end gatekeepers of our website. And again, when it comes to SEO, there are things a web developer would do over an SEO. So there are crossovers, and that's why it's kind of confusing sometimes. Okay, so that's the web developer. They build our site, they touch the code, they touch the technical things, they understand the relationship between different parts of the website, they understand how a website should work, the backend HTML. They understand in and out our WordPress, but they also understand our other tools and other integrations that we're using. And they're really there to make sure that our website is functioning 100%. Okay, so let's move on to a web designer. So just off the bat, let's look at that word. Designer is someone who designs. So they are designing our graphics. So they are looking at the overall look and feel of the site. So a web developer is building, right? The coding aspect of a website that a web designer might design. So not all web designers know code. A web developer should know code. A web designer doesn't have to, because they're kind of like the architects, right? Maybe that's a good analogy. The architect, right, draws out the design of the house, and you've got the interior designer who also decides the color of the curtains and the walls. So that's kind of the same vibe as the web designer. They're designing the overall look and feel. They use Photoshop or Canva in many cases to create custom graphics. They are, they know about their photography. They know about color combinations. They also, some web designers, again, this isn't all, but many of them are branding experts. And so they really understand how your brand will be represented through specific colors. And they understand the psychology of color. They understand the psychology of the texture and the text and the font that you have on your website. So they are really conscious of that look and feel. And so again, if we compare back to a web developer, not all web developers have that sort of skill. Actually, many web developers don't really know what looks good. They just know how to code it. And there are hybrids, okay? Not all web developers are like this. And I just trying to be careful not to offend anybody, because there are web developers who do have really great web design skills, but they're just different. They're different roles. They're different skills. Something else that a web designer might have a special skill at is understanding the overall user experience. It's called UX. And so what that means is, how do we want someone to experience our site? What pages do we want them to visit? And how do we want them to feel when they open and they load our site? So this is something that a web designer would definitely have in mind. This has to do with some of the wording you use. So they might have some copywriting experience. They might look at, where the top navigation is placed, and how it looks when you roll your mouse over it. And there's just so many details that go into that. Obviously the graphics, but they'll look at your photography, like I said before. So there you go. If you get a sense of what that's about, there's a clear distinction between a web designer and a web developer. And again, you do have unicorns of people who are really great designers, and they create beautiful, beautiful things. And they also know how to code, and they know how to create those designs. But they are two really different skills, because one is designing it and the other one's building it. And there needs to be a back and forth. Just like when you're building a house, maybe the interior designer will say to the architect and to the construction workers, we don't want to build the window this big because it's Or, maybe we want to build the window this big because it's let in more light and that's nice for the design. And then the architect goes and says, well, we can't build it that big because, it's not going to support the weight structure of the building. So same thing happens in a website. There is a back and forth, and that's totally normal. And if anything, it's a good thing because there's kind of like this collaborative element that creates some really cool websites and cool projects. Okay, so we have the web developer, we have the web designer, and so let's get into what an SEO does. So an SEO, a search engine optimization expert, or an SEO, they specialize in really understanding what is Google looking at when it comes to getting ranked, and also, turning that traffic into a paying customer. So of course there is crossover because a beautifully designed website by a web designer is something that Google and the humans are looking for. And then a website that is well built by a web developer who knows her or his code is also something that Google really cares about. And the humans also care about a sturdy website. So there's no contradiction between all of these roles. And in big companies, you have all of these roles work together. So just off the bat, that I have to say that just because you hire a web developer doesn't mean you don't need an SEO or vice versa. It depends on your right now what you're prioritizing. It depends on what your availability is, because sometimes working with several people is very overwhelming, and it depends on your budget. And again, there are crossovers, so there could be an SEO expert who does have coding skills like myself, or there could be an SEO expert who does specialize in web design, which I, for example, don't, but I do talk a lot about user experience. So there is crossover. If you do want to know more about the SEO process, I'm not going to get into super detail about the different elements of SEO, but I do have another episode 136. I go into quite a bit of detail about what is like inside of the SEO experience. So check that out if you're wanting to know more, episode 136. So the thing with SEO, and the thing that I find fascinating and many of my clients find super annoying, is that it's a really many different areas of things that can impact your site. There's the technical aspect. So are there errors? Are there broken links? How's your site loading? There's the keywords and the content, which is what most SEO experts are known for, helping clients find keywords that will be profitable for their businesses and getting them warm leads and good traffic to their website. And then there's the backlinking aspect. And so what that means is Google looks at what other sites are sending you traffic and what's their trust factor, how trustworthy. If the New York Times is quoting you must be a pretty awesome website. But if you've got other spammy sites, or if you're doing like link schemes and stuff like that, then Google will bring down how trustworthy you are. And so that's something that an SEO expert can help you determine and then take action on. The other aspect that I'd say is different if we compare a web developer and an SEO expert is that an SEO expert is really, really looking at how is this impacting your rankings? So all of these aspects, the site speed, the technical stuff, and the keyword, they are really looking at it from the Google perspective and the human who is searching for something in Google. And many SEO experts have more of a strategic mindset around this. So they're looking at, like I said at the beginning, they're really looking at, how is this impacting your bottom line? How is this helping you get more sales, get more customers, get more leads, whatever you're really focused on right now? An SEO expert should really be looking at that, and not so much worried about, well, this code is, not loading in a certain way. So there are different ranges, like I said, of people who are just more technical, and so you'd want to hire them with a specific job in mind. And then you have other web developers, web designers, and SEO experts who have a real business mindset around what you do and they want to understand your business. They are asking questions about what you're selling right now, how you're selling, how you're serving your audience and your customers. And so they're really building a strategy that reflects that. And that's really, really important. Some SEO experts can fix code errors, and some of them have many limitations. So, for example, in my case, I have in the past, done redirect jobs for my clients. So I'm helping them fix any 404 errors on their site. I do have some boundaries around what I do, but I touch code. I've, done it before, and I'll probably keep doing it. But in general, I say this very lightly, we'd say a web developer is going to have a little bit more of coding skills because they're just doing it more often. It just depends. And this is totally something I recommend you ask your SEO expert, what are their limitations around coding and stuff like that, because they might be asking you to do things that you can't do and they can't do, and so someone has to do it. And this is something that comes up in the projects I do, depending on the website. I'll say to the client, first of all, I always ask the client if they're working with someone, because it just is really great when they have a web developer who can take full ownership of that, or someone who can support me as I'm making changes and just validating those changes. And many of my clients, I'm collaborating pretty ongoing with their web developer or their web team. And then the SEO expert, I think the biggest distinction is the copywriting and the keywords. So they're really interested in how we're using those keywords to attract the right people, and how we're creating content that is just really, really juicy and really interesting for people to read. And this could be something a web developer or web designer is interested in, or it might not be. It just really depends on where they lean towards. Thinking of them as skills is much easier, I'd say, because there might be someone who actually does all these things very well, and they're just like awesome. Okay, so let's get into the different scenarios of what could be happening, and who you would hire in from my point of view. So let's say you don't have a website and you want one. So you started your business, maybe you're in year 1 or year 2, and you've been, ramping things up without a website. You've been just using your Instagram and your Facebook page. And so now you want a website. Who would you hire? I would say you were going to hire a web developer and a web designer, or some sort of combination of the two. So a web developer and a web designer will get your, fresh baby website up, and they will help you just have the basics of a good website with your services, with a bit of content, and just get it up and going. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is I have a website, but I want to redesign my website. So you've got a platform that you like, but you are wanting to change the design. So here, depending on what you want to do with the redesign, you could actually hire all 3 positions. So you could have a web developer who's going to help you build out whatever you're redesigning. You'd have a web designer who's going to design the site for you and make it look beautiful. And then also having an SEO expert who would help you not just redesign it, but also make sure that the redesign is working in your favor in terms of keywords and in terms of content. So depending on what the purpose of the redesign is, I have clients who they're redesigning and they just haven't really been paying attention to their blog that much. So now they want to add that. And so they want that SEO strategy. And then I have other clients, it's just purely like more of a visual redesign. So in that case, maybe you hire a web designer and then you just kind of put it up yourself. Actually, that's what I did with my Squarespace site. I hired a designer, and then she helped me a little bit actually, but then I ended up doing some of that design myself because I have those skills. But it just depends how much time you want to spend on that. Sometimes it's faster and easier just to get someone to do that for you. Okay, next scenario. I want to integrate a blog into my website. So this happens a lot. You have a website, but you never did a blog. And so you don't know where to start. And you actually have some like blogging technology. We're assuming you're not using something like Squarespace, but you want to like integrate your blog correctly with the URLs, and you have quite a few blog posts. So, I mean, you could totally do this yourself if you have the skills. But if you have like a lot of blog posts and you want to do it right, again, you would hire potentially an SEO expert for sure, a web developer potentially, if you want that back-end coding help, and also potentially a web designer if you want someone to help you design your website, your blog correctly, because there are a lot of questions and decisions to be made. But for sure, an SEO and a web developer for that one. Okay, next scenario. We have a couple more. I want to intentionally work on my traffic attraction and make sure my website is serving my business. So this is a little bit of a broad statement, but I guess what I wanted to say here is that many times I have people, and I sense this happens to many of you who are listening, is that you have this beautiful website and it's like, just gorgeous. And it's super representing who you are right now and your brand and your business. But you feel like, why isn't anyone coming here? There's no traffic, or it really hasn't grown, or maybe it's plateaued in the last little bit. And so you're just like struggling and you're feeling stuck. So the first person in this case, I think is so important is an SEO expert, because they're going to really be able to pinpoint what's going on for you right now and what's going on for your website and why you've been stuck there. And they're going to be able to help you understand who you need to hire next. Because unless you have a web developer who is SEO savvy, and that can exist, sometimes a web developer might not be able to see the full picture of what's going on in your website when it comes to keywords and content, and it comes to your backlinking as well. So it's important to know what you need to focus on first in order to get that traction, because there are so many things you can do with your website. And I've seen a lot of people kind of spin around in circles, and they just get so overwhelmed with everything that needs to happen that they don't end up doing anything. So getting your priorities straight, potentially doing an audit, getting some clarity around the keywords you want to be ranking in, will then help you understand, okay, this is what I need to do in the next 3 to 6 months to change this and to get some traction. So an SEO expert will help you put that plan together. And we're assuming that the SEO expert is looking at all aspects of your site, including technical, backlinking, and the content and keywords. Not just keywords, but all aspects of your website. And again, you can ask them about this when you're hiring someone or interviewing someone. Ask them what they do in their audit. What do they look at? Don't be afraid of just really getting some details about how they work, so you can know if it's the right person. Okay, so there's 2 more scenarios I want to run through. So the next one is, I'm migrating to a new website platform. Okay, so I really believe that this requires probably everybody, a web developer, an SEO, and a web designer. Again, you could have a hybrid, you could have someone who has all these skills, so it's really about the skills that we're looking at. So when you're talking about a new website platform and a migration, when we're thinking about SEO, it's really, really important to make sure that your URLs are migrated correctly, because you could really lose some serious traffic if you are not taking that time to look at your URLs and just how everything's migrating. I actually have an episode on SEO migration. So that is episode 86, top 3 mistakes when migrating a website. I give you some tips there if some of you have a migration coming up. But yeah, I definitely think all of these, and especially if you're kind of migrating to a new platform and with a new design, having a web developer for sure, and then a web designer could definitely help with all of this. And then the SEO expert's going to just be that person who's going to make sure that you're not losing traffic after migration, that everything gets set up correctly with the Google Analytics, and they're monitoring that as you are like moving into your new home, basically. Alrighty, and then the last one is, I want to build new content for my site that attracts my ideal client. So this one, feels kind of obvious to me, but this is definitely an SEO with a potential of a web developer. So like I said before, many times when I start working with my clients, I always ask them, if they have a web developer on their team. And if they don't, if we are building quite a bit of content and they don't want to get involved in that, I will recommend a web developer, because that web developer will help speed up the process of getting things set up. And sometimes, I also get quite involved in that process, especially at the beginning. But having a web developer and someone who, understands some of the basics can be really, really helpful. Alrighty, so those are all my scenarios, and I did want to wrap up the episode with a couple other complementary episodes that will help you with this information that I shared in this episode. So these are all just episodes that talk more about the SEO process. So the first one is episode 137, technical SEO. So there I really get into what it means to do technical SEO. I give some examples just so you have a clear distinction of what that looks like and what to ask when you're hiring an SEO expert. Then we have episode 141, which is types of SEO services. I've already mentioned this. So if you are thinking about hiring someone and you've got maybe the difference between an SEO agency and SEO consultant, it's really good to see the difference between those two things and kind of the pros and cons. So that's episode 141. And then we have episode 130, which is SEO for new sites, and episode 131 for SEO for old sites. I'll include all these in the show notes if you guys are getting dizzy with the numbers. But I created these like back-to-back twin episodes because there is a really different strategy when you have a baby site versus a site that's like over 3 to 5 years old. And it's really important to distinguish that. And this is something that I really clearly started to see with my clients, that a new site needs just like a baby needs different type of food in the right order, right? A new site needs different attention versus if you're trying to rank an older site. So again, that's episode 130 and 131, SEO for new sites and SEO for old sites. Alrighty, well, that was a lot of information, so take it all in. And yeah, remember that these are all skills. I don't want to pinpoint one person on everything because people are just so unique, and you might be hiring a web developer who's actually very web design friendly, or you might be hiring a web designer who has lots of coding skills. So at the end of the day, we're looking at these as skills and how they're going to serve your business and serve you to help you where you want to go. All right. Thank you so much. And I will catch you next week on the podcast. Bye. Hey, this is Cynthia, and I wanted to once again thank you so much for coming on and listening to this episode of the Digitally Overwhelmed podcast. I spend a lot of time creating these episodes and editing them and publishing them, so I would love for you to leave me a review, whatever platform you're listening to your podcast on, whether it's iTunes or something else. Go ahead and click on that review bar, give me some stars, and leave a little comment. That really helps other people just like you find the podcast and just helps them grow their business. And if you want to find out more about this episode and more about what I do, get links from the show notes that we mentioned in this episode, you could head on over to digitalbloomiq.com/podcast. And there, the latest podcast should be published. If not, you'll need to scroll through and find your podcast number. Thank you so much for listening again, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Digitally Overwhelmed podcast. Bye.